Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome to Prost with Peter. I'm Peter. Today I want to talk to you about the biggest differences between professional brewing and home brewing. First off, I want to talk to you a little bit about my own experience. I've been home brewing for several years. I was doing it very occasionally at first, and then in the last 3-4 years or so, I have been doing it much more consistently. Just over 2 years ago, I decided to quit my non-brewery job. I was working as an arborist, aka tree guy, and I started looking for brewery jobs. I started as a barback, and then bartender, and then keg washer, only occasionally, part-time, then full-time in the brewery, started working as a cellarman, worked my way up to a shift brewer, and then got a new job here in LA, and I've been working as an assistant brewer for about a year now. Alright, before I get started, I do want to mention that there are exceptions to most of these things, and home brewing and professional brewing kind of exist on an interesting plane where there's a gray area. You can have a professional brewery that's one barrel, 31 gallon batches, and a home brewery that's pretty much the exact same thing with similar equipment if you've got the funds for it, which I wish I did. So some of these things get into a gray area, but what I'm thinking about is the average home brewer with a couple years of experience and a pro brewery that sells beer on site and off site maybe, and has a larger operation. So with that being said, let's get going. First, I want to talk about how home brewing and a professional brewery are inherently different concepts. Think about it as a restaurant versus cooking for yourself at home. Yes, there's a scale. You can be a really good chef and make your friends really good meals, but having the idea of sales and marketing and all of these things differentiate home breweries from professional breweries on a lot of different levels. So just making sure like these are inherently different concepts with different goals. That changes the dynamic of a lot of things in a brewery. One of the biggest things with a professional brewery is all the people you have to please. So no matter what position you're in, unless you are the head brewer and owner, which is possible of a small brewery, but you may be just the brewer or assistant brewer, and as much as you want to brew everything that you want, you might not be able to. There are customers, and there are investors, and there are owners. There's a ton of different people to please, so that can really push you down different directions that as a home brewer, you get to brew whatever you want, whenever you want. You are the person to please. If you want to brew for your friends, then you get to do that, but you never have to. Those are two huge different things that I've noticed between pro brewing and home brewing. Another thing on the pro brewery side of things is you might have consistent core brands. As a home brewer, you can brew something once a season, you can brew something just when you want to, you can always do new beers, and I've been to some breweries that haven't brewed the same thing twice, but most medium to larger breweries need to have their consistent core brands. Especially this past year with canning so much, packaging so much, having your core brands and your things that are making it into cans is crucial. Say customers want to buy your IPA, they want your IPA to taste like your IPA every time. You need to work on your consistency and probably be regularly brewing some of the same beers. Whereas a home brewer, you don't have that constraint, you don't have to have core brands. Although I know myself and many home brewers love to brew a similar beer once a year, say a stout in the winter or a pilsner just before summer. My next point is about time and turnaround speed. As a home brewer, you're not on anyone's time scale. If you want to put a time constraint on yourself and have a beer ready by next weekend, that's on you. But at a brewery, you need to be moving things through tanks and you need to be putting product out, whether that's into cans or kegs or just moving it from the fermenter into a bright tank. You need to be moving things along in the process as soon as you possibly can to make room for a new beer. With that comes something that I know a lot of home brewers haven't really experienced or aren't that worried about, that a lot of breweries are really worried about, which is diacetyl. It is an off flavor that's common in beer, it's produced by yeast, and it can show up in a lot of beers. Some are more susceptible than others. But most breweries, once you've reached around your target final gravity, you start doing diacetyl testing. So that's a process where you check for those off flavors. And the yeast will clean that up itself. So it shouldn't be an issue if you could let it go 14 to 16 days and just leave the beer in the primary fermenter for a long time. But when you're a brewery, you need to move that along. Homebrewers have the advantage of being able to leave the beer in the primary fermenter for 14 plus days, and professional breweries really need to get that moving along. So they're worried about diacetyl, they do testing, and once it's clean, it gets crashed to a colder temperature, and they get the yeast out of the beer. Another huge difference in time is just brew days. When you're doing a 30 barrel batch, that's huge. I gotta do the math, but 30 times 31, when a homebrew batch is 5 or 10 gallons, that's huge, and it takes a long time to mash in, to move your wort from your mash to your kettle. that's the runoff, that can take a really long time. And getting 30 barrels of beer up to 212 degrees can take a long time too. So brew days can run 8 to 10 hours. Whereas hopefully, as a home brewer, if you've got your process dialed in, you can do a full hour mash and a full hour boil and still be in the fermenter with yeast pitched in under 4 hours. So that's huge, and that's often why there's 2 shifts at a brewery or just longer days. Maybe you do 4 10-hour days. But it really adds to the time you spend brewing, and it can make it a little bit tedious. It definitely is just a different beast when you are doing the whole process on a huge scale. The next big difference between pro brewing and home brewing is your ingredients. The biggest difference is that pretty much every brewery needs to have a plan for the ingredients that they buy. This hits all of the core ingredients, but it does them in a little bit different way. So with hops, you typically need to have a plan for the hops that you're gonna use. So when you buy hops or you have a contract for hops, you need to be planning on using those hops within a certain amount of time. I know myself as a home brewer, I go online or to my local homebrew store, I see a hop I haven't used before, and I just sometimes pick it up with no plan for it, and then I decide later what I want to do with it. Or if it's a hop I've been excited about, I pick up 8 ounces. You know, it can be a little bit loosey-goosey, and I can figure out the details later. Hops at a brewery, usually you have a lot more because you're a brewery, but you also have probably fewer selection. At work, we don't get 18 different types of hops in different amounts. Typically, we've got 6 to 8 types of hops in larger quantities. Those get us through pretty much all of our core beers. That's definitely different than a home brewer where you might be experimenting with a new hop almost every time you brew. There's pluses and minuses to both things, but when you are a brewery, you might need to hop at however many pounds per barrel. And when you're a home brewer, you might just want to save some of that money and think that that giant dry hop is a little overkill. Another big point, another big difference is house yeast. There's a bunch of really cool yeasts on the market. I've done a video on Lucha. I've done a video on Bonanza. I literally had to look at my kegerator. I've tried different Kvik yeasts, tons of stuff from Imperial, and White Labs is pretty local to me, so I get a bunch of stuff from White Labs, and whatever it is, I love trying new yeasts. I'm always getting new yeasts and trying stuff. But breweries pretty much, if they're brewing consistently, will have a house strain, a house yeast. A lot of times the house strain is a Chico strain, something like a Cal Ale yeast, pretty standard, and they'll move it from a finished fermenting beer that's recently crashed down, so all the yeast is settled at the bottom. They'll move that into a freshly brewed wort and combine the two to make the beer. And that can get a brewery 9, 10 plus pitches for buying yeast. When homebrewers buy yeast, we're spending $8, $9, $10 a packet for a cool liquid yeast and $4 for a dry USO5, maybe $2.50. When you scale that up to a 30 barrel batch, yeast is very, very expensive. Yeast is like scary expensive. So if you're not making use of that yeast as many times as you possibly can, then your business is going to struggle. So breweries are very, very conscious about reusing yeast. And when you've built up a bunch of yeast and you have a ton of yeast from a brew and you pitch that yeast into fresh wort, that yeast is very excited to get started chewing on something else. And you get really, really good, vigorous, fast fermentations and consistent fermentations. So that's super, super important. And homebrewers care about their yeast health, and you can pitch onto a yeast cake and you can overbuild your starters. But for the most part, pro brewing and home brewing inherently different with their yeast. When it comes to malt, it varies, and if you're a smaller brewery, this may not apply, but a lot of medium to large breweries have grain silos. So a truck comes and pipes in grain to a giant silo, and that all has to be one base grain. So a lot of times it's 2-row, could be Pilsner, whatever it is, it's a base grain. It's probably gonna be the core of most of your beers at a brewery. So I know a bunch of breweries, and one I worked at before, are 70 to 90% one grain, and most beers are that one grain. A lot of times brewers will do a base Maris Otter, a base Golden Promise, a base Pilsner, a base 2-row, any of these things. That can be really, really challenging to do as a medium to large brewery. All right, my final point about some of the biggest differences between home brewing and professional brewing is equipment. This one you may need to take with a grain of salt, because I know there's a ton of people that just love to invest in their home brewery, and that brings them up to the quality of a professional brewery. I've seen professional breweries with 1 vessel systems all the way up to 4 vessel systems. So vessels are the different containers that you can mess around with your wort in. The three most common that I see are a mash tun, a kettle, and whirlpool vessel. At home, I use a brew in a bag setup, which is a 1-vessel system, and at work, we have both a 3-vessel and a 4-vessel system. Things can get really complicated really fast, but basically you're doing the same process. It's just what equipment are you using to do it. Another thing that's a bit different from homebrewing is having very large stainless steel conical fermenters. The conical is the cone base at the bottom. I know that a lot of homebrewers do have stainless steel conical fermenters that can handle pressure, but it makes a big difference in terms of dropping your yeast. And if you've got a bunch of ports on it, like breweries would, you can recirculate beer under pressure. So that means you can add adjuncts or biofine or many different things you can lager without having to worry too much about oxygen getting into your beer or having an unsanitary environment. Those are pretty expensive for homebrewers, but I know some people have them, whereas they're pretty much required for a professional brewery. The last thing in terms of equipment that I see at every brewery I've been to, and I don't really see at many home breweries, is bright tanks. Bright tanks are tanks where you bring finished fermented beer to carbonate and add some adjuncts. Most home brewers go from a primary fermenter into a corny keg, and that's what I do at home, and it works really well. And I force carbonate in my corny kegs, but at a brewery, when you are possibly canning some of your batch, and maybe you're bottling some, and you're kegging some into the Sankey top kegs, those are the professional keg tops, you need to have carbonated finished beer in a tank that you can then divvy out. So bright tanks are what that's for. You can add fruit or extracts or things in there, but usually you've got a finished product in there and you bring it into the bright tank to carbonate and then distribute into containers. And that's at pretty much every professional brewery, and I don't personally know a home brewer that has one. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this interesting and entertaining. I know most of my audience is home brewers, and if you are in the industry as well, hit me up in the comments down below. We can chat. If you want to see me homebrew, check out the rest of Prost with Peter. And in the meantime, Prost.